Yeah, I'm here. Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to this Gaming in Holland webinar, in which we will take a closer look at the additional player protection measures that were recently proposed by both the Netherlands Gambling Authority and the Ministry of Justice. My name is Willem van Oort. The new rules would, amongst other things, introduce new player deposit limits and require operators to intervene within 1 hour after detecting problematic player behavior. In today's webinar, we will discuss these player protection proposals and how these will impact the Dutch regulated gambling market. But of course, before we kick off today's webinar, I would like to thank our strategic partners and sponsors, which you can see on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your generous support. We would not be able to do this without you. Thank you. Also, as always, our webinars are interactive. If you would like to participate in our poll or submit a question to one of our speakers, Q&A at the end of the webinar, please use the Slido app. To use Slido, please scan the QR code that you see on screen right now on the left, or visit slido.com. Then enter the event code #GIH. Finally, select either the live polls or the Q&A tab on the top of your screen. Today we only have Q&A. Questions will be addressed and, if possible, answered during the audience Q&A at the end of the webinar. Also, if you see somebody else's question and you like it, you can upvote that. With us today, we have 3 expert speakers. We're welcoming gaming lawyer Justin Franssen, who is partner at Kalff, Katz and Franssen. Peter Paul Goeij, who is managing director of trade association NOGA. He will be there in a second. And Björn Fuchs, who is board member of trade association VNLOK. Welcome, Justin. Welcome, Björn. We are very happy to have you. The first speaker of today is Justin Franssen, who is head of the gaming and gambling practice group at the law firm Kalff, Katz and Franssen. Justin, thank you very much for being here. We very much appreciate it. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Willem. Thank you for the invite.
Always a pleasure. Justin, before we properly kick off, could you first briefly explain what the new rules and regulations have been announced?
Yes, Willem, we have to distinguish between 2 distinct subject matters. One is, of course, the letter of the Minister of Legal Protection, which was sent to Lower House on the 21st of December. And secondly, on the same day, the draft responsible gambling policy rule, which was released by the Gambling Authority. And I certainly try to be concise and not go into all detail, but I'll give you the gist of both. Maybe let's first start with the letter of the minister. And you have to understand the context of the letter to understand the exact measures he's actually proposing. Minister basically starts by saying, well, there are worrying and undesirable developments since the opening of the remote gambling market in October 21. And he feels that the current law is based on abstract principles, a law he, by the way, designed himself, or his predecessor, I should say, and that license holders take too much leeway in adopting those principles and do not take enough responsibility to protect players. And in that, he's referencing specifically to 2 reports. One from the National Rapporteur Addictions, which came out in Q4 of last year. And the other one was the investigation of the Gambling Authority, also in Q4 last year, on the duty of care. And the Gambling Authority established essentially that the duty of care is filled in a variety of ways by a variety of operators. So that's the sort of context. And the minister then feels compelled to take far-reaching measures now, even though the broad evaluation of the Gaming Act should take place this year. So let's dive into the key points here. On registration, that's the first point. So we currently have Article 414 of the Remote Gambling Decree, which requires an operator to enable the player to set a login limit, a deposit limit, and an account balance limit, as we all know. And the minister is calling essentially for what you could call a neutral environment, where players are not nudged in setting a limit of, let's say, 5 or 10,000, but it should be completely neutral. So the drop-down menus are no longer allowed. The player should be in full control of filling out those limits. The environment for the limits may not contain any visual or auditory reference to gambling, pictures of gambling, for instance, or evoke positive associations with gambling. And a license holder must ask for confirmation from the player about whether he is willing to lose the monetary limit chosen. So if you choose a limit of, let's say, 300, some confirmation is asked from the player. And the idea is that this should make the player sensitive to and aware of the potential losses. And obviously the monetary limits must be made visible in euro. Interesting also is that if a player wants to set limits, a deposit limit, a limit of 350 a month, or 150 for a young adult, then personal contact needs to be made by the operator with the player. It is, by the way, possible to have a much higher deposit limit, but only after contact is established with that particular player. And in doing so, the license holders must inform the player about the risks, the possibility for exclusion into crux, and the possibility of help via loket kansspel. And oh yes, there's also quite important, players that are currently in the existing database need also to be contacted. So a lot of players have whatever, a deposit limit of 5,000. You need to, let's say, your historically built up database needs also to be subjected to these rules. So this is actually before playing, and then you have measures that are going to be implemented whilst playing. And the whole idea behind is that awareness should be raised. There will be the obligation to inform the player at the start of the game if the standard stake amount differs from the minimal stake for that particular game of chance. So oftentimes you have, let's say, a slot. The default stake you will see is €1, whereas you can play with less, for instance, with 10 cents. This is also one of the comments made by the Consumentenbond, Consumers Association, in their recent investigation, as all of you may remember, some of you may remember. So this is a particular one. Then a license holder must always show the stake of the player in euros, for instance. Typically, or in some cases, the stakes are shown in points. And the idea of the minister is that this, doesn't make the player aware that he's actually playing for real money. So those are the key points. So there are measures before you start playing and whilst you are playing. Also interesting is that there is again a discussion, of course, on overarching playing limits. As you may remember, Willem, in the past, the minister looked into this and he basically said, well, it's technically very difficult or maybe even not feasible. And now he comes back to that and he says, well, it may be technically feasible. It requires more research. And I will, I'm looking to implement this, but this is going to take a bit more time, and this will only happen most likely after the evaluation of the Gaming Act. So overarching playing limits will come. That's quite clear. As to the timelines, we are currently in a position where we are in a public consultation, which ends in roughly less than 2 weeks, actually, at the end of the month. Yeah. And the idea would be to implement these measures by Q4 of next year. Whether that is achievable remains to be seen, because he's also hinting on the fact that the new measures, or at least some of the new measures, need to be notified to the European Commission. But surely they are going to come. So that's the letter of the minister. Then, second part, Willem, if you allow me, is the revised or draft revised responsible gambling policy rule, as said, which was also published on the 21st of December. Actually, I realized I made a mistake. The consultation for the the remote gambling policy rule is ending very soon. The draft regulation, which I just discussed of the minister, will be put out for public consultation, of course. And that the remote or the responsible gambling policy rule, that one should possibly enter on the 1st of April 2024. The idea behind the changes in the proposed changes in the responsible gambling policy rule are also, I would say, primarily driven by its own report, an investigation into the duty of care, which was published in September 23. And the objective is to clarify the open norms laid down in that piece of legislation. While looking at the draft responsible gambling policy rule, and I'm surely not going to discuss each and every point there, but some notable new provisions or amended provisions. 1.1, for those of you who are currently reading the responsible gambling policy rule, there is a new definition on net deposits. So this means deposits minus withdrawals to a player account, as currently referred in Article 1.1 of the Remote Gambling Decree. There is an interesting new or an amended provision, Article 2.5, on the definition of vulnerable groups of persons. One category has been added. Those are consumers who have no more than the social minimum referred to in Article 2 of the Toeslagenwet. It's difficult to translate, but I guess it's something like the Supplementary Benefit Act or the Welfare Act. But essentially, people with a very low income are categorized as a vulnerable group of persons. Article 2.7, a new provision with non-exhaustive elements and very broad elements for the NGA to assess whether a hybrid license holder, so an operator who has both a remote operating license as well as a land-based license, advertise their online offer through land-based advertising. So essentially, if a land-based operator makes advertising, if you look at the new suggested provision, the gambling authority will have a very broad definition in place to say, well, you're also now indirectly advertising for online. We don't like that, and you need to stop that. So it's more. It has given much more detail than before. Let's see what else. Article 2.8, new definition on, or more clarity, I should say, on what is considered advertising with the use of role models. And this includes, in any case, that websites and social media of license holders and role models may not refer to each other, insofar, obviously, as the role model ban applies. What else? Yeah, quite some new provisions in 3.1.12. And here I believe we're going to get quite some discussion and debate. According to the proposed provision, license holders must be able to recognize signals of or responsible suspicion of excessive participation as soon as possible But as you refer to into your introduction, Willem, in any case within 1 hour. And if you look at the explanatory memorandum, that 1 hour intervention doesn't necessarily require human intervention. It could also be automated, luckily. Then also new is a provision added with more internal and external signals indicating excessive participation or risks of gambling addiction, such as nighttime participation, the use of credit cards to deposit, playing more than 6 hours in a day. And then also in 3.112, description is given on signals that a player can no longer bear the financial consequences of his playing behavior. And then the authority comes up with a whole list of elements, such as such a signal could be you cannot withdraw funds anymore, you cannot pay a parking fee or a cab ride. But then something really interesting is introduced, which is essentially boils down to an affordability check. And the default position is that if a young adult, for instance, makes a net deposit more than 300 per month, or an adult makes a deposit more than 700 per month, that could be a signal, where a player can no longer bear the financial consequences of his playing behavior.
Yeah.
The 300 and 700 limit is not, let's say, the only reference made. I mean, if you have proper knowledge of the income level of a particular player, and you know what is left to spend for gambling, then this 300 and 700 euro limit does not seem to apply. But the default position is the 300 and 700. If you if a player plays more, this requires you for an operator to do an investigation. So basically to check the payslip, I would say, of a particular player.
Yeah. Listen, shall we leave the introduction at this, because we will tackle some more of these topics during the further questions, or is there something burning that needs to be added to this?
Yeah, I'm checking. Well, there's much more to say, but let's leave it for now.
Great. Can just say thank you. There's a lot of stuff to digest here, but some of the things are extremely clarifying. I would like to remind the viewers at home and in the office that if you have questions, please point your camera to the QR code on the right, Slido, event code GIH, and you can ask or upvote any questions there. Quick second one, Justin. And there has been already a lot. What are the, should we be ready to expect additional protection measures beyond what you just said? Maybe keep it short, or we can skip it. I think we covered a lot already, briefly, unless you have something to add.
If you look at the press release, which came out on the 21st, it contains a handful of elements which were totally not discussed in the letter of the minister. So I expect a follow-up letter. One of the things that was mentioned, for instance, in the press release, that a player should be reminded of his play essentially every 30 minutes. That's one. And then there is also the obligation to involuntarily lock out a player during play if he reaches his limit. So just imagine you are in a poker tournament and you're booted out. I mean, that's a bit problematic. Or you just betted on a soccer game and you're watching the stream, but you're not actually betting, but you've reached your time limit. Then you're basically excluded from the website. At least that's how it's presented. The other indication that another letter will follow, you can find in the letter itself. Basically, the minister says, well, I'm speaking to the Ministry of Healthcare also to look at restrictions on tobacco. So, yes, there will be a follow-up letter for sure. And I'm expecting Q1.
Okay. Good, more coming,
And
more
of course,
coming.
well, I'm
And
sorry
thank you
to
very
add,
much, Justin.
there's a debate in Parliament on the 7th of March for the Permanent Committee of Justice. So there's a lot more to come in the next months for sure.
Great, Justin. Now we know what to expect. Let's look how the operators, players, and the market will be impacted by these newly announced rule changes. And to answer these questions, we are now joined by Peter Paul de Goeij, who is Managing Director of Trade Association NOGA, and Björn Fuchs, who is Board Member of Trade Association VNLOK. Welcome, Björn. Welcome, Peter Paul. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Fine.
Thanks for having us.
That's super important. First question, and I'm looking at you, Björn. How will operators be impacted by the proposed regulatory changes that Justin has just summarized?
Well, let me start by saying that we understand that these documents have been sent, and we, of course, as a trade organization, are 100% committed to duty of care and to having clarity. And I think clarity is the word that is the first thing that will impact us with the documents in place. Because, of course, in the wordings and what Justin just described, there is still a lot of uncertainty and unclarity what the precise obligations are. And if there is still room for interpretation, I think it will not only provide operators with a lot of extra activities, but also with a lot of extra creativity to find out where within the bandwidth of interpretation they have to execute. And from that point of view, we as a market would really appreciate more clarity and more specific definitions in these rules.
Peter Paul?
Yeah, I agree with Björn. And when these draft policy rules were introduced in December last year, our initial response was that what this sector needs and what player protection needs in the Netherlands is more clarity. It is a better understanding of what it is to be bound by the duty of care. And to basically get rid of the open norms. So the intention behind these new drafts are good, but in the execution and in the wording, there is still, let's say, room for improvement. So it's good that there is a consultation so that we can add to the set of rules. But just as mentioned by Justin, for instance, on the reference to the Toeslagenwet, the Social Benefits Act, on how you should be able to ascertain whether someone is below the social minimum level. That article is very convoluted. Even a native Dutch speaker and with some legal knowledge myself, it was very hard for me to get a good grip of who sits below this level, because there's an enormous list of situations that people may be in. And I was thinking, well, how can you verify whether this is the case with every single player? So that's an example. And another example is that whilst the KSA have tried to further specify the existing regulations, they still introduce words like players that are excessively trying to win back their losses. Well, the word excessively is multi-interpretable. So I think we should try and get away from these open norms as much as possible and make sure that the regulations are how do you say that, are clear to everyone. So it remains to be seen whether the current draft is leading to feasible and practical regulations.
Yeah, I hear you're worried about the practical feasibility, Peter Paul. Björn, we're going a little bit long into this webinar, so let's try to keep the answers within the time limits, please. But I think you wanted to add something to this.
Yeah, and practical feasibility. I think we have to also take into consideration that introducing all these new elements like net deposits, etc., will also require a lot of technical development on the side of the operators who are depending on platform suppliers who have a certain time element and a certain schedule. So we have to be aware that it will take more than a couple of months just to get the technical part of this in place.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Björn. Very interesting thoughts and practical considerations here. Once again, for those at home and in the office, please add your questions to Slido, point your camera to the QR code, enter the GIH hashtag, and you can either ask or upvote a question. Moving to the next question, Peter, Paul, Björn, how do you expect that players will react to these new rules?
Yeah, so one possible outcome of the draft policy is that players will fragment over more player accounts. And in that case, it becomes harder to have a view of whether a player is maybe moving into the wrong direction because he's scattered over more operators. So fragmentation is a risk that that we definitely recognize.
Björn, anything to add?
In addition to that, I think we also have to take into account that particularly Dutch people are not very fond of people asking them too much question about their financial situation. So the willingness with regard to providing that information to get that proper and clear view on the player situation, that's a big question mark and that's a big risk. With that, of course, players will be creative, and if they have the need to gamble and are not willing to submit this information, they will start to get creative and look for an alternative outside the legalized offering.
Yeah, absolutely. Fully agree. This is also shown in the online gambling barometer done by Ipsos. It clearly shows that people are not very open or willing to share the source of income. Another worry that we have is that the effects will be overly burdensome to, let's say, the average player, whereas the effect on the big spenders is more likely to be counterintuitive in a way that, you know, the big spenders might be looking for alternatives where they do not have to get over the hurdles. And they might end up playing with illegal operators, which is something that, you know, would be very frustrating, of course, because we try to increase consumer protection, not decrease it by dechannelization.
Björn, anything to add?
Absolutely. I also think that we have to look to the consumer perspective and see if what is happening and what is being imposed upon them is proportional. For instance, if I am working at the post office in the morning and I'm up in early nights, is it proportional that I'm being asked questions because I play after midnight? Sequentially hassling the consumer with things that are not relevant or proportional will eventually have a negative effect. And then one could beg to differ if it isn't about player protection, but demotivating the player to actually gamble. And there's a fine balance that we have to find in that duty of care to prevent that we are actually hassling the consumer and making them turn away from the legal offering.
Great. And I think now that we have a sense of how the new rules will impact operators and players, Björn, Peter, Paul, let's look at the bigger picture. For example, what impact will the proposed rule changes have on the regulated market as a whole? Peter, Paul?
Well, again, I work from best intentions, so I believe that the intentions are good, and this is all tilted towards increasing consumer protection and preventing big problems from arising and people ending up in the gutter because they gamble too much. But I am very concerned that let's say the de-channelization effect might be larger than is currently thought. I'm also concerned because the current number, the official number of channelization in the Netherlands, I think is a very optimistic one. If I see what you can find as a normal internet user while going to Google, I'm concerned that if we put too many locks on the door, we lose too many consumers to the illegal offer. So this is something that we have to be really, really careful of, and we need to track and measure what is happening to consumers, because it would be a big waste if it turns out that we scare consumers away.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Paul, Björn?
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that we are really in need of more visible and effective action in the fields of illegal advertisements on Google by not licensed operators, and also cutting off, of course, the financial means. If the path for financial means towards the illegal offering is still in place, and there's still digital promotion, over focusing and over regulating the legalized offering will have a negative effect. So we have to prevent the worst from happening, because these rules will have a major impact on licensed operators, both from a activity and resources perspective, both from a financial and commercial perspective, let's be honest. And trying to balance all that with regards to player protection, even though the trigger is being pulled before the evaluation from Goeij in October, before the actual numbers from the gambling addiction from Ladis, how big is the problem? We have to be able to safeguard balance moving forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Björn. Thank you, Peter, Paul. So we are half an hour into this webinar. I also thank everybody for adding questions to Slido. A lot of questions there that we will answer shortly, but please feel free to either upvote a question or add a question. Point your camera to the QR code and it will do the work. A question to everybody, and welcome back, Justin. Will the new rules increase the risk of player claims? And what can operators do to mitigate this, possibly, to all of you?
Yeah, first, I would think the question for clarity will be the first step, because more clarity will also mean clarity for both the operator and the consumer. But if the wording stays the same, and if you look, and just mentioned a few of the words that were in there in regulations, but if it is too vague, consumers, and we've seen the trend in the last couple of months, at least at our company. And I think it's the same for other companies, that more and more quote unquote smart gamblers are trying to use the system in their own advantage just to get their money back. And that has nothing to do with player protection. So more clarity and more specific definitions will mitigate the risk of player claims. But that's not something we as an industry can do by ourselves. We will need the guidance and the help of the KSA and the ministry for that.
Thank you, Björn. Justin, Peter, Paul?
I'll let the lawyer speak first.
No, I expect that the answer is probably going to be yes, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, players, I mean, this is also something we have observed in other jurisdictions. Players typically will find an exploit, and I think they, with the new Article 3112 I was just describing, so on the deposit limits, I think there is some level of, let's say, appreciation by the operator left. It's not binary in that sense, not entirely binary. So, of course, some players will find an exploit. So, clear yes, Willem. And then what can operators do to mitigate this? Well, I don't know at this point, unless you would be, but this is not commercially viable, unless you would be very strict on the net deposits, and you would basically say, well, you know, I'm simply not accepting players who want to deposit more than 700 a month, but realistically, that's not going to happen.
No.
So I'm afraid you really can't protect yourself properly from play claims.
Yeah, and I'd like to add here that, you know, it has already been quite a task and a feat in the sector and for the KSA and the ministry to get a clear understanding of what is currently considered to be under the duty of care. So I'm wondering if any judge, when asked, can do that in a whim and can do that very easily. I don't think it is that there is a common legal understanding of, you know, when you have broken the duty of care and when not, and because of the open norm, and we're trying to move away from this, but yeah, I'm not sure whether the draft regulations or the draft policy in its current form will actually increase the risk of player claims, or maybe it will stay the same or deteriorate. I don't or get less. I don't know.
Thank you, Justin, Peter, Paul, Björn. Anything to add? I mean, it's a wide question. But I guess we leave it at this. So it's 40 minutes into the webinar. I think we covered a lot of things already, and I'm super happy. We've seen large participation, 216 registrations today. Moving to the audience, Q&A reflects that. There's a massive amount of questions. We will not cover all questions today, but I guess we have time for a handful, so let's say 3 or 4. First question to the experts here. Could you please clarify whether you see implementation of these new measures announced by the Minister in Q4 24 or Q4 25? So can you clarify whether you see implementation of these new measures announced by the Minister in Q4 of this year or Q4 of next year?
Shall I, Peter, Paul, Björn?
Volunteers.
Okay, so the Minister is pointing to Q4. Whether that is achievable, if you look historically at these sort of announcements, it happens all too often that they're not met. So delay is possible. Secondly, the Minister is also referring to notification to the European Commission, which could always lead to a delay, always. And then, of course, we have the evaluation of the act. So all that together, putting that in the blender, you know, we may face delay. Nevertheless, the Minister is aiming for Q4. But don't hold your breath, I would say. By the way, typically this is going to be put into a regulation, at least the stuff the Minister released on the 21st of December. Typically, that's the introduction of such new regulation comes at the beginning of a quarter. But if something is really, really urgent, you could basically say, well, let's do it on the 1st of December. That is possible.
Yeah. Crystal ball and blender. Anything, Peter, Paul, to add? Björn?
Well, you know, when I think of implementation, I'm thinking of my members who have to implement these new regulations and these new policies into their platforms, into their call centers, what have you. And I am concerned that the view of this implementation may be too optimistic on the part of government, which is a strange thing, of course, if you think that the government itself is not very good at implementing changes into IT systems, etc. But this is no easy feat. So these changes will require a lot of time, a lot of man hours, in order to prevent any big, big problems from arising. So,
yeah, Peter Paul, I'm more concerned. I mean, the letter of the minister. If you look at what has to be implemented there, I think it's probably, I'm not going to say easier, but more achievable compared to the draft responsible gambling discussion, because what we're having here is that by the end of this month, the consultation ends, right? Then, the consultation reactions need to be implemented, if any. Then it will be released. Let's say, you tell me why, I have no clue as to when they are going to release it. But let's say a month before the implementation date of the 1st of April, realistically, operators will start programming or reprogramming their websites only if they have the exact specifications. They will not start just, there's simply no capacity with most operators. So
true, I agree. I was
so
thinking,
you'll have, realistically, you have a month. You'll have a month to implement. And that, when I talk to our clients, they're all panicking because they cannot make a month.
And let's also take into account that there will be the implementation on April 1st. Then we have the evaluation in October. Maybe something comes out of that, probably will. Then the implementation of yet another set of rules. And after that, so it's change after change after change. So from the perspective of proportionality, with regards to administrative burdens and resources, it is also a alarming situation for operators to have change upon change. And even though, just as you mentioned, the changes are rather simple, it still remains to be seen what will add up after the evaluation and what will be added to that list. So there is still a great question mark and a concern at the operator side that is feasible in any practical way.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's leave it at this. It's a good question. It was upvoted many times. Again, you can still go to Slido and upvote other questions. I think there's no more time to add the more questions. Going to question number 2. Let's keep it in the two minutes or so, gentlemen. The new vulnerable group element. There are elements like married or single, cost sharing or not cost sharing. Should this info be requested known prior to the first deposit? So it's a bit dense question. The new vulnerable group element. There are elements like marriage, being married or being single, cost sharing or not. Should this info be requested prior to the first deposit? It's a detailed question, but I guess it's a crucial one. It was upvoted many times.
The problem is, as Peter Paul was also saying rightly, there is no further detail. There is just a reference, a clear reference to Article 2 of the Toeslagenwet, which is a very, very complex piece of legislation. But, in my mind, probably, when you have a new player registering, I think they have to go for something like a checkbox, where, are you subject to, and so forth. Yes, no. The issue there is that, players in that category may flip in and out of the Toeslagenwet. So they may not be in Toeslagenwet today, but it might be in 3 weeks. So what do you need to do? Do you need to constantly check, or as an operator, whether or not that particular player has moved into that category of vulnerable players? I mean, from a practical perspective, I see some issues there.
Yeah,
just
agreed. And that you might even be asking for information that the player itself is not doesn't know himself whether he qualifies under the Article 2 Toeslagenwet, some sort of subsection. This is very highly detailed information. I wouldn't know whether I qualify under subsection 3B1 of some law that I don't even know exists.
And this actually feeds into the earlier question on, do you expect to see more player games? Well, yes, here is one element.
Yeah.
Of course.
Björn, anything to add?
No, I think both the gentlemen covered it all.
Great. Now, I think there's a lot to this. So, third question here. Again, thank you for everybody for participating so actively to the Q&A today. The backlash against gambling, this person is asking, it's an anonymous, is driven by anecdotes about players quickly losing a lot of money. Do trade associations have a strategy to prevent this from happening? So, the backlash against gambling is driven by anecdotes about players quickly losing a lot of money. Do the trade associations, we're looking at the right side of the screen, have a strategy to prevent this from happening?
Well, if there was one clear-cut strategy, we would have it on the table. But just to give you some insight, of course, we see a development that facts have left the station way before the implementation of rules is there. So the fact-based and proportional setting up of rules and regulations is a big concern. And of course, there is a huge backlash. But we are currently, of course, having dialogues with stakeholders throughout the field to get the right insights and the right perspective on the table. And of course, the anecdotes of which are selectively picked out and used have to be countered by facts. And so we are anxiously waiting for the official latest numbers. We are doing active research on what are the actual effects there. We are having dialogues with the different stakeholders. So yeah, we are busy there, but the clear-cut strategy, which will have the ultimate effect that everybody will be 100% positive about the gambling industry, is not yet achieved.
Yeah.
Thank you, Björn. Peter Paul?
I agree completely. And to add to this, our prime directive is to aim for 100% channelization and consumer protection. Will there be a time when there are no anecdotes or no extreme situations? I'm afraid not. We must be honest about this, but it is our duty to try and prevent harm from arising, and when it arises, to try and stop it from developing further. And that is where our strategy lies. So our operators have a holy duty to act when they see something going south. And I would like to add that a number of the anecdotes that is referred to over the last few years is due to the open norm that we had on duty of care, because we all have a different understanding of what is problematic gambling. When is a player developing problematic behavior? We all have a different understanding. This is wrong. The legislators should set clear rules that are the same, that are the same for everybody. So we need to move away from the current situation of the open norm and have a duty of care that is crystal clear to everyone, to players, to operators, and predictable, so we know what we have to abide by.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter Paul, Björn. Quite clear. I guess we should go to the last question of the webinar. We are nearing the 55-minute mark here. Last question to all of you. How worried should we be about the upcoming parliamentary evaluation of the Remote Gaming Act? So how worried should we all be about the upcoming parliamentary evaluation of the Remote Gaming Act? Gentlemen, last question, let's keep it short.
Well, I am worried, which is my second nature. But I am worried. If you look at the political parties that won this election, one of them, who won 20 seats out of nothing, has it in their governmental, or let's say their the rules that they want to implement, to roll back legislation, which I think would be disastrous. I think it's due to the fact that they don't realize that the online gambling regulations were introduced to protect consumers. So yeah, hopefully we can sway them and convince them that, you know, they have to protect Dutch citizens against the dangers of unregulated gambling. But I am concerned.
More concerned, Björn, just then?
Yeah, I share that concern absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, the trend of having political movement and legislation and new regulation based on opinions and anecdotes has been a trend for the last couple of years. I think from a European perspective, the Netherlands can win an award for changing legislation as fast as we did. So yeah, those are worrying signs that we have to be aware of moving forward to October. But again, as Peter Paul mentioned, our duty to protect the player, to have a proper offering, but also to show what this legislation has already done in that perspective, that remains, and that will be our daily task.
Thank you, Björn. Justin?
Yeah, my answer is probably not very different from Peter Paul's and Björn's, but I mean, the concern I do have is that we have a lot of new parliamentarians who have no prior experience. You know, they have been confronted with the whole array of negative news since the opening of the market, the ban on the use of role models, the ORCA decree, so the ban on untargeted advertising, the enormous amount of negative press commentaries. Are these people really aware of the rationale of the legislation? Why on earth did we decide to regulate again? What's the channel, right? Channelize these players into a regulated environment. Yes, and things went wrong, in some cases horribly wrong. But will we see a rational debate, you know, in the course of this year on the legislation? We'll have to see, but I'm not overly optimistic, as you can clearly notice, I guess.
Okay, I think rational debate is a good point to close the webinar. Since we're running out of time, let's wrap this up. So thank you, Justin, Björn, and Peter Paul for sharing your thoughts and answering the Q&A here at the end. I'm very certain that your insights were very, very much appreciated. Thank you very much. And with this, we've come to the end of this Gaming Holland webinar. We hope you found it useful. A link to a full recording of today's webinar will be shared in the post-webinar email that we'll be sending out as soon as possible. As always, let's keep in touch. If you have not signed up for the free newsletters and print magazines, please do so at www.gamingin.eu. So that's gamingin.eu. We hope to see you soon at one of the events at the Gaming Holland Lunch at ICE or at the conference on the 6th of June. Thank you very much.